the forgotten fortress where an empire faced its final night. A drum. Somewhere beyond the dark, a drum is beating. Not fast, not slow, steady, like a heartbeat that does not belong to any single man, but to thousands, moving as one animal through the black hours before dawn. Smoke drifts low over broken stone. It smells of sulfur, of scorched rope, of something sweeter underneath, blood, cooling on cold ground. A hand grips a sword hilt, so tightly the knuckles have gone white as bone. Somewhere behind a wall that has stood for 1,100 years, a man kneels in the dark and prays to a god who, tonight, does not seem to be listening. He is not a peasant. He is not a soldier plucked from some forgotten village. He is an emperor. And in a few hours, he will be dead, his body never found, his empire erased from the map of the world before the sun has fully risen. This is the 29th of May, in the year 1453. This is the last night of Rome. Not the Rome of marble senators and gladiators, long turned to dust 1,000 years before. This is Rome's final skin, its last living heart. A city called Constantinople, wrapped inside walls so vast, so ancient, that for 11 centuries no army on earth had broken through them. Tonight, that will change. Tonight, behind those walls, 49,000 desperate defenders wait for an army of more than 60,000 to come and end everything they have ever known. By morning, an empire that outlived Rome itself by 1,000 years will cease to exist. And it will begin, like all great endings do, in silence. The drum stops. And in that silence, something far worse begins. To understand how a single night could kill an empire, you must first understand what that empire had already survived. Constantinople was not simply a city. It was a fortress the size of a civilization, built by an emperor named Constantine who, 1,100 years earlier, had looked at a small Greek fishing town called Byzantium and seen the shape of something eternal. He built walls in triple rows, one behind the other, so that even if attackers broke the first, they would only find themselves trapped between two more, crushed by defenders on every side. He built towers so tall that soldiers standing atop them could see ships approaching from 3 seas at once. He built a city meant to never fall. For over 1,000 years, it did not. Persian armies broke against those walls and retreated bleeding into the dust. Arab fleets besieged the city not once, but twice, and both times sailed home in defeat, their soldiers dying of hunger and disease outside gates that never opened for them. Bulgarian Khans, Rus raiders, Crusader knights. All of them came, and all of them, in one way or another, failed to take the city by force alone. The walls became legend. Sailors whispered of them from Venice to Alexandria. Children in a dozen languages were told bedtime stories about the city no army could break. But legends rot from the inside before they ever fall from the outside. By the 15th century, the empire behind those walls was a ghost wearing the armor of its former self. Once it had stretched from Spain to Persia, its emperors ruling the known world from a throne dripping in gold and silk. Now it was little more than the city itself, a handful of scattered islands, and a memory of greatness so distant that most of Europe had already stopped calling it an empire at all. The streets inside those legendary walls told the truth the walls themselves refused to admit. Grass grew between the paving stones of what had once been the busiest avenues on earth. Entire neighborhoods stood empty, their buildings crumbling, their gardens turned wild and untended. The population that had once numbered 500,000 had fallen to perhaps 50,000, a city built to hold an empire, now inhabited like the tomb of one. And yet the walls still stood. And yet the people still believed, in the way the desperate always believe, that stone and prayer might be enough to hold back what was coming. They were wrong. Because outside those walls, in the spring of 1453, a young sultan was already awake, staring at a map by candlelight, and dreaming of the one thing his ancestors had wanted for 800 years and never managed to take. He did not intend to fail where they had. His name was Mehmed, and he was 21 years old. That single fact should tell you almost everything about what happened next, because history rarely gives its most devastating blows through the hands of old, cautious men. It gives them through the young, the ones with nothing left to lose and everything left to prove, the ones who have not yet learned the caution that comes from failure, because they have not yet failed at anything that mattered. Mehmed had inherited the Ottoman throne twice. The first time, as a boy of 12, his father Murad had briefly abdicated to test whether his son was ready to rule. The boy was not ready. His own soldiers nearly mutinied under him. His father was forced to return, humiliated, from a peaceful retirement he had clearly wanted, dragged back into the burdens of the throne by a son too young to hold it. Some men would have broken under that shame. Mehmed did not break. He waited. When his father died in 1451, Mehmed took the throne again, older now, colder now, and this time, no one dared to test him twice. His first act as sultan was chilling in its efficiency. He ordered the drowning of his own infant half-brother, eliminating any rival claim to the throne before it could grow into a threat. The child's own mother reportedly begged for mercy. There was none given. This was not an act of cruelty for its own sake. Or perhaps it was, and history has simply chosen to call it something gentler. Either way, it was a message, sent in the coldest possible language, to every man in the empire who might one day think of challenging him. There would be one sultan. There would be one will. And that will was already fixed, with an intensity that bordered on obsession, on a single target. Constantinople. Mehmed had studied the failures of every man before him who had tried and failed to take the city, his own great-grandfather among them. He had studied siege engineering. He had studied naval warfare. He had summoned Christian and Muslim engineers alike, offering fortunes for anyone who could solve the one problem that had defeated every army in 1,000 years. How do you break walls that cannot be broken? A Hungarian engineer named Orban gave him the answer. Orban had first offered his services to the Byzantine Emperor, who could not afford to pay him. Mehmed could. The Sultan gave the engineer nearly unlimited resources, and Orban repaid that faith by designing the largest cannon the world had ever seen. A monstrous bronze tube longer than a modern school bus, capable of firing stone balls that could shatter a wall 1,000 years old in a single strike. It took 60 oxen and hundreds of men to move the weapon into position. When it was tested, the sound of its firing was reportedly heard from 10 miles away, and pregnant women in the city are said to have miscarried from the shock of it. This was not simply an army marching toward Constantinople. This was the entire weight of a new age of warfare, aimed like a blade at the throat of the old one. And inside the city, one man knew, with a certainty that must have felt like ice in his chest, that he did not have the men, the money, or the miracles required to survive it. His name was Constantine, and he would be the 11th Roman emperor to bear that name, and the very last. To call Constantine XI's empire a machine would almost be generous. By 1453, it was less a functioning state than the skeleton of one, its bones held together by desperation, faith, and diplomatic begging. The empire's treasury was, by most accounts, nearly empty. Taxes could not be collected from provinces that no longer existed. The great Byzantine navy, which had once ruled the Mediterranean, had shrunk to a handful of aging ships. The famous Byzantine bureaucracy, once the most sophisticated administrative system in the medieval world, now managed little more than a single city and its dwindling suburbs. And religion, the very force that had once unified the empire, had become one of its deepest wounds. For centuries, the Eastern Orthodox Church had been locked in bitter theological conflict with the Roman Catholic Church in the West. The wound was old, dating back to the Great Schism of 1054, but it had never fully healed, and by the 15th century it had calcified into something closer to hatred than disagreement. Constantine understood, with the cold clarity of a man drowning, that his only realistic hope of survival lay in Western military help, and that help came with a price the Church of Constantinople was not willing to pay. In 1439, his predecessor had signed a union agreeing to bring the Orthodox Church under Roman authority, in exchange for promises of Western Crusader support. The people of Constantinople despised the agreement. A popular saying spread through the streets in those final years, one that captured the depth of the city's self-destructive pride. Many would rather see the Sultan's turban ruling in the city than the Pope's mitre. They got their wish. When Constantine finally proclaimed the Union in the Church of Hagia Sophia in December of 1452, in a desperate final attempt to summon Western aid, many of the city's own clergy refused to attend the Mass at all. Some Orthodox priests reportedly stated they would rather die than pray alongside Latin rites. Western Europe, meanwhile, was distracted, exhausted, and increasingly indifferent to the fate of a distant, half-forgotten empire that many considered doctrinally corrupt and politically irrelevant. The great crusading spirit that had once launched 100,000 knights toward the Holy Land had cooled into something closer to disinterest. A handful of volunteers came, most notably a Genoese soldier of fortune named Giovanni Giustiniani, who arrived with several hundred trained men and, crucially, deep knowledge of siege warfare. His arrival gave the defenders their only real professional military leadership. But a few hundred foreign volunteers, however skilled, were never going to be enough to hold walls stretching for miles against an army of tens of thousands. The machine behind Constantinople in its final year was not an army. It was a prayer, wrapped around a wound that had been bleeding for 400 years, held together by the stubborn faith of men who suspected, deep down, that faith alone would not be enough. Then everything changed. On the 6th of April, 1453, Mehmed's army arrived beneath the walls, and the last siege in the history of the Roman Empire began. The sound came first. Before the army was even fully visible, the defenders on the walls could hear it. A vast, rolling murmur of tens of thousands of men, horses, camels, and wagons, moving across the plain like a single living organism made of iron and flesh. Then they saw the tents. Row after row after row, stretching from the shore of the Sea of Marmara to the waters of the Golden Horn, an ocean of canvas that seemed, to the exhausted eyes of the defenders, to have no end at all. Estimates vary, but most historians agree Mehmed's forces numbered somewhere between 60 and 80,000 men, soldiers, engineers, sailors, and support troops, along with the terrifying new cannons that Orban had built. Against them, Constantine could gather perhaps 7,000 trained soldiers, supplemented by armed citizens, monks, and foreign volunteers, bringing the total defense to somewhere near 49,000, spread thin across 12 miles of walls that a proper garrison would have needed 3 times that number to hold. The bombardment began almost immediately, and it did not stop. Day after day, the great guns roared, hurling stone balls weighing as much as a small carriage into walls that had stood since before the birth of Islam itself. The largest of Orban's cannons could only be fired a handful of times per day. It took hours to cool, to reload, to realign, but each shot struck like the fist of an angry god, and slowly, section by section, the ancient stones began to crack, crumble, and fall. At night, while the guns rested, the defenders worked like the damned to repair what daylight had destroyed, hauling rubble, driving wooden stakes, packing earth and brushwood into the wounds torn through their ancient walls, buying themselves another day, and then another, and then another. The city's harbor, the Golden Horn, was protected by a massive iron chain stretched across its mouth, preventing Ottoman ships from sailing directly in to attack the weaker sea walls. It was one of the defenders' few remaining advantages. Then Mehmed did something no one had thought possible. In a single night, using greased logs laid across the hills behind the city, his engineers hauled dozens of ships overland, around the chain entirely, and lowered them into the Golden Horn from the other side. The defenders woke to find an enemy fleet floating in waters they had believed impossible to reach, a sight so surreal that some contemporary accounts describe soldiers on the walls simply staring in disbelief, unable to process what their own eyes were showing them. But that was not the worst part. The worst part was what it meant. It meant there was no direction left from which the city was safe. It meant the noose, already tightening for weeks, had just closed completely. Inside the walls, food supplies dwindled. Fear spread faster than any disease. Rumors moved through the starving streets that the Hungarians were coming, that a great Venetian fleet was on its way, that God himself would send a miracle at the final hour, as he had, the old stories said, so many times before. No fleet came. No army marched to their rescue. The miracle, if it was ever meant to arrive, arrived too late to matter. By the final week of May, both sides understood what was coming. Mehmed's advisors were divided, some urging him to press the assault immediately, others warning that a prolonged siege risked disease, mutiny, or the sudden arrival of a Western relief force that could turn the tide. Mehmed chose to attack. On the evening of the 28th of May, he gave his men one final day of rest and prayer, promising them, according to Ottoman custom, 3 days to plunder the city's wealth once it fell, everything except its stone and its walls, which he intended to keep for himself. Inside Constantinople that same night, Constantine gathered what remained of his court, his soldiers, and his clergy in the Hagia Sophia, the same great church where, 5 months earlier, the doomed union with Rome had been declared to empty pews and bitter silence. Now, on the final night of the empire, the church was full. Orthodox and Catholic, Greek and Genoese, soldier and priest, all of them kneeling together in a building that had stood for 900 years, taking communion side by side for what many of them already suspected would be the last time in their lives. Outside, in the dark beyond the walls, the drums of the Ottoman army had already begun to beat. At the height of its power, centuries before this final night, Constantinople had been the wealthiest and most dazzling city on earth. A place Western Crusaders, upon first glimpsing it in 1204, reportedly could not believe was made by human hands. Its cathedral, the Hagia Sophia, had stood for nearly 1,000 years as the largest enclosed space in the world, its dome seeming to defy gravity itself, floating above worshippers as if held in place by nothing but divine will. Its emperors had once controlled trade routes stretching from Britain to China. Its treasury had overflowed with gold, silk, and holy relics said to include fragments of the true cross itself. Foreign ambassadors, upon entering the imperial throne room, were reportedly greeted by mechanical golden lions that roared and a throne that rose slowly into the air on hidden machinery, a theater of power designed to make even kings feel small. This had been Rome's final, brilliant flame, a civilization that had watched the western half of its empire collapse into darkness 1,000 years earlier, and had somehow, against every historical expectation, endured, adapted, and even flourished for another 10 centuries after Rome itself had fallen to barbarian kings. But peaks, in history as in mountains, are always measured by the fall that follows them. By 1453, that golden age was a memory so distant it might as well have belonged to a different civilization entirely. The Fourth Crusade of 1204 had already dealt the empire a wound from which it never fully recovered. Western Crusaders, ostensibly marching to liberate the Holy Land, had instead sacked Constantinople itself, looting its treasures, shattering its institutions, and installing a Latin emperor on its throne for over half a century. The empire that eventually reclaimed the city in 1261 was a shadow of what had been lost. It never regained its former wealth, its former territory, or its former confidence. It simply endured, growing smaller and smaller, like a fire slowly consuming the last of its fuel, until only the embers remained. And now, in the final hours of May 1453, even those embers were about to go dark. The peak of Byzantine power had been a golden dome rising above the world. Its final hour would be that same dome, lit not by imperial glory, but by the flickering candlelight of a mass for the dying. What the history books rarely dwell on is the private cost carried by the man at the center of it all. Constantine XI Palaiologos was not born to rule an empire on the edge of annihilation. He was the fourth surviving son of Emperor Mehmed II, a man who came to the throne almost by accident of succession, inheriting a crown that by then was less a symbol of power than a burden of impossible expectation. He had spent years as a capable, even admired governor of the Peloponnese, a southern Greek territory that was, by the standards of the collapsing empire, relatively stable and prosperous. Some historians suggest he might have lived a longer, quieter life if fate had left him there. Instead, in 1449, he was crowned emperor, not in the great Hagia Sophia, as tradition demanded, but in a small provincial ceremony, because the political and religious tensions in the capital made a grand coronation too dangerous to hold. It was a quiet, almost apologetic beginning to what would become one of history's most famous endings. He never married. He had no children. In the final desperate years of his reign, negotiations were reportedly underway to arrange a marriage that might bring him allies, but time ran out before any union could be completed. He would die, by every historical account, alone in the sense that mattered most, without an heir, without a wife, without the personal legacy that other men measure their lives by. What he carried instead was something heavier, the full, crushing knowledge that he might be the man remembered for 1,000 years as the emperor who lost Rome. Contemporary and near-contemporary accounts describe his final months as a study in exhausted, grinding determination. He personally walked the walls each night, inspecting defenses, encouraging soldiers, distributing what little money and food remained from what was left of the treasury. He reportedly offered to melt down sacred church vessels to pay his mercenaries when funds ran out, a decision that surely tore at a man raised in the deep, unquestioning piety of his age. He begged, in letter after letter sent to Rome, to Venice, to Hungary, to any Western power that might listen, for aid that never fully came. Historians have described these final appeals with a particular kind of sorrow, not the desperate pleading of a coward, but the exhausted persistence of a man who understood, with growing certainty, that he was asking for a miracle he did not truly expect to receive. And beneath all of it, quietly, corrosively, there must have been paranoia. Whom could he trust? Which advisors doubted him? Which nobles were already, in the privacy of their own homes, considering what terms they might negotiate with the Sultan if the city fell? Divisions between Orthodox loyalists and pro-Union factions ran through the city's elite like a hidden fault line, and Constantine, more than anyone, understood that an empire divided against itself makes for very poor company in its final hour. He was, by nearly every surviving account, a genuinely brave and honorable man, one of the few Byzantine emperors of the era remembered without significant accusations of cruelty or corruption. But the hidden cost of the crown he wore was this: he would spend the final years of his life fighting a war he almost certainly knew, in the coldest part of his own mind, that he could not win. And he chose, knowing that, to fight it anyway. That is not weakness. History rarely offers a colder definition of courage. The final assault began in the deep hours before dawn on the 29th of May, 1453. Mehmed sent his troops forward in carefully organized waves, a strategy designed to exhaust the defenders through sheer, relentless attrition. First came the irregular troops, poorly trained, poorly equipped, sent forward almost as expendable shock troops meant to wear down the defenders' strength and ammunition before the real assault began. They were beaten back, bodies piling in the ditch before the walls. Then came the Anatolian regiments, better trained, better armed, hurling themselves at the breach the cannons had torn through the walls near the gate of St. Romanus. The fighting there was brutal, hand to hand, in darkness lit only by torches and the flash of gunfire, men screaming in half a dozen languages as they killed and died within arm's reach of one another. They too were repelled, though at terrible cost to both sides. And then, as the sky began to lighten toward dawn, Mehmed sent in his final reserve, the Janissaries. These were the Sultan's elite infantry, drawn from a system that was itself one of the darkest engines of the Ottoman machine. Christian boys taken from their families in conquered territories through a levy called the Devshirme, raised from childhood in absolute loyalty to the Sultan, trained into some of the most disciplined and feared soldiers in the medieval world. They came forward not in a chaotic rush, but in tight, disciplined ranks, moving with a terrifying calm that must have chilled the exhausted, bleeding defenders watching them approach. It was in this final assault that fate, or chance, or the simple exhausted cruelty of war, delivered the blow the city could not survive. Giovanni Giustiniani, the Genoese commander whose professional leadership had held the defense together for weeks, was struck by a bolt or bullet and severely wounded. In agony, he insisted on being carried from the walls to seek treatment. His men, seeing their commander leave, began to panic and follow him. Constantine himself reportedly begged Giustiniani to stay, understanding with instant, horrified clarity what his departure would mean for the men still fighting. But the wound was too severe, and the Genoese commander was carried away regardless. Within minutes, the section of the wall he had commanded began to collapse into chaos and retreat. The Ottomans surged into the gap. Somewhere in the confusion, a smaller gate called the Kirkaporta, left unlocked and unguarded in the panic, was discovered by Ottoman soldiers, who poured through it into the city itself. The wall that had held for 1100 years had finally, in the space of perhaps 20 minutes, come apart. Constantine, understanding that the battle and the empire was lost, reportedly tore off the imperial regalia that marked him as emperor so that he would not be captured and paraded as a trophy, and rode into the chaos of the final fighting as simply another soldier of the city he had failed to save. He was never seen alive again. The empire survived for 1100 years. The man did not survive its final morning. What actually happened to Constantine XI remains, to this day, one of history's genuine mysteries. No confirmed body was ever recovered. No tomb exists. No grave marker bears his name. Some later accounts claim his body was identified among the dead near the walls, recognized by the purple boots emperors traditionally wore, embroidered with the imperial eagle, a small, tragic detail, if true, since it suggests he died fighting not as a symbol, but as an ordinary soldier, indistinguishable in the chaos except for the color of his shoes. Other accounts, less reliable but more romantic, describe his head being sent to Mehmed as proof of his death, or displayed briefly to the terrified population before disappearing from the historical record entirely. Legend and folklore filled the vacuum left by missing facts, as legend always does. A Greek myth emerged in the centuries that followed, the story of the Marble Emperor, who was said not to have truly died on that final morning, but to have been turned to stone by an angel at the moment of the city's fall, hidden beneath the earth near the Golden Gate. Waiting in silent sleep for the day he would awaken, rise again, and reclaim the city for its rightful people. It is, of course, only a story, but the fact that such a story took root and survived for over 5 centuries tells you something the historical record alone cannot: that the loss of Constantinople was not simply a military or political event. It was a wound so deep in the collective memory of an entire people that they needed, psychologically, to believe their last emperor might somehow return. Inside the fallen city itself, that morning brought no mercy. Ottoman soldiers, granted the traditional 3 days of plunder promised by their sultan, moved through the streets in a wave of violence and looting that contemporary accounts describe in devastating, harrowing detail. Churches stripped of their treasures, civilians killed or enslaved, centuries of accumulated art, manuscripts, and relics destroyed or scattered in a matter of hours. Mehmed himself reportedly rode into the city later that same day, making his way through streets still smoking from the violence, until he reached the Hagia Sophia. He entered the great church, the same building where, hours earlier, defenders had taken their final communion together, and according to several historical accounts, he ordered it converted immediately into a mosque, a transformation that would define the building's identity for the next 5 centuries. Standing beneath that vast, ancient dome, the young sultan is said to have reflected, quietly, on the fragile nature of earthly power and glory, even as he stood at the absolute peak of his own. An empire that had outlasted Rome itself by 1,000 years had ended not in some slow, gentle fade, but in a single violent morning, its final emperor's body lost forever to history, his grave, if he is one at all, unmarked and unknown. Stand today at the site of those ancient walls, and you will find them still standing in places, broken, weathered, patched with newer stone, but recognizable, running for miles along the edge of a modern city that has grown up around them like skin healing over an old, deep scar. Tourists walk along sections of them without always understanding what they are looking at. Grass grows in the old moat. Children play in parks built into the shadow of towers that once held back the armies of nearly every great power of the medieval world. The Hagia Sophia still stands too, its dome still seeming, as it did to Crusaders 8 centuries ago, to defy the simple laws of stone and gravity, though it has changed identity twice more in the centuries since that final morning, from church to mosque, briefly to museum, and back to mosque again. each transformation a small echo of the empires that have claimed it. The fall of Constantinople in 1453 is remembered by historians as one of the true hinge points of world history. The event that, in the traditional telling, marks the symbolic end of the medieval world and the beginning of something new. Byzantine scholars fleeing the city carried with them ancient Greek and Roman texts that would help fuel the Renaissance already stirring in Italy. European powers, suddenly cut off from traditional overland trade routes to Asia now controlled by an expanding Ottoman Empire, were pushed to seek new paths by sea, a search that would, within decades, lead Spanish and Portuguese sailors toward the coasts of a world Europe did not yet know existed. An empire's ending, in other words, helped quietly ignite the beginning of the modern age. But strip away the grand historical narrative, the dates, the geopolitical consequences studied in university lecture halls, and what remains is something smaller and somehow heavier. A drum, beating in the dark. A man kneeling in a church that would not survive the morning as it had been. An emperor who tore off the symbols of his own power so he could die simply as one more soldier among thousands, defending walls that had stood for 1100 years and would fall, in the end, not because they were weak, but because empires, like people, cannot outrun time forever, no matter how thick the stone, no matter how deep the faith, no matter how desperately the dying refuse to believe the ending has already begun. Every empire believes, in its final years, that it is different, that its walls are the ones that will never fall, that its God, its gold, or its glory will be enough to hold back what is coming. History does not remember that belief kindly. It simply waits, patient as stone, for the night the drums finally stop, and reminds us, once more, that nothing built by human hands, however ancient, however sacred, however legendary, was ever truly built to last forever.